The final section of this interview is about a set of introspective questions. The first question is who, or if there's multiple people, that is fine, do you believe have had the greatest impact on the scholar you became?
Well, there are a number of the people. One is a woman. Let me mention her first.
Good.
I've mentioned New Zealand, but I haven't emphasized it. But I spent, I think I counted up 20 trips to over 20 trips to New Zealand. It started in 1983, when I was invited to speak at the first South Pacific Conference on Reading. I'm not a reading person, never tried to pretend to be. But obviously reading and literacy and language are all mixed up together.
Sure.
And I had met, previous to 1983, at conferences held at in Pittsburgh at the Lauren Resnick's Center for Research and Development, LRDC. She ran a series of conferences on early language development. And I went to attended them, and so did this woman from New Zealand named Marie, but it's pronounced Mari Clay, C-L-A-Y. And she is known to many people in this country as well as in New Zealand, Australia, and Great Britain, and elsewhere, as the person who developed a tutorial reading program called Reading Recovery. And we had met at these Pittsburgh conferences, and then when I was invited to speak in Auckland, New Zealand in 1983, I'm pretty sure that invitation was inspired by her, because I don't think anybody else would have known of me at all. But that started a long time relationship with, personal relationship with Mari, and a relationship with New Zealand educational issues and equity issues, because they have a very large and important indigenous group comprising about the same proportion of the New Zealand population as African Americans do here, far more than Native Americans do, though Native Americans would be the comparable group in indigeneity, the Maori.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up getting a Fulbright to New Zealand, spending a year there, and going back many times. And I really quite fell in love with the country. So Mari was would consider herself a developmental psychologist. But her work in developing reading recovery was very much an educational intervention, a tutorial program. I mean, it would be called remedial reading, terrible title. Better, reading recovery. And interesting, when somebody asked her, why do you call your program Reading Recovery? Why recovery? And she said, it's a sailing term. Now, New Zealand is this little narrow North Ireland, South Ireland, and nothing is more than 70 miles, I think, from the sea. So it's a big sailing. For a while, the sailing, the America's Cup was always often involved with sailing in and around New Zealand. And recovery is a term that you get off course and you recover. So it's the same idea as remedial, I guess, and it would be considered a synonym in some way, but a much gentler, natural effect of getting off course and then getting back on course. And she was the one woman who I would certainly include in the most important mentors. After that, there are a bunch of men. Because I didn't have many women professors in those days.
Sure.
I have to say that my husband would be one of them, simply because he encouraged me after I had gone back to teaching to think about going back to Harvard and getting a doctorate degree, and developing my educational ideas further in that route. So I'd have to consider him. Mm-hmm. And in some interesting ways that I wouldn't try to explain, his work in musicology was related to some of the work that I did in language as well, because one of my mentors in the language field was an educational anthropologist and linguist named Del Hymes, Hymes. And some of the ideas in the field of ethnography of communication, which he helped develop in the 1960s, while Chomsky was developing his very different ideas also in the 1960s. But some of Norman's ideas about musicology and music history bore interesting intellectual relationships, conceptual relationships to some of what I was talking about and learning to talk about in education and educational ethnography. So Del Hymes was one. Jerome Bruner, we already mentioned, was another. Hugh Meehan, who I had worked with in that year that I taught school in San Diego and continue to keep up with, is certainly one. Except for Jerry Bruner. Well, Jerry Bruner has passed away. Del Hymes has passed away. Mary Clay has passed away. A number of them. Hugh Meehan is still alive and well. And finally, I have to mention Alan Luke, who is also alive and much younger than a decade, 60s, several decades younger than I am, and whose conversation with me is the introductory chapter in this 2018 book on communicative competence, classroom interaction, and educational equity. And he has a book in the same, he has several books in the same series. I would certainly add Mari Clay, my husband, then Mari Clay, Jerry Bruner, Del Himes, Hugh Meehan, and Alan Luke.
Perfect. Okay, so the next question can be education oriented or in general. What do you find inspiring, or what inspires you?
Now, not much. The political situation is so calamitous that I hope we can all survive it.
Okay, so that goes to the next question. What do you find uninspiring? And so it might be the same answer.
The political situation right now.
In our country.
In our country. And thereby its effect on other places.
Sure.
Without going into details about it.
Sure. What is your favorite word?
Word? I don't have one.
Okay. What profession other than your own would you have liked to attempt?
Nothing outside of language. I would like to have taken more work in literature and especially in poetry, which seems to me the most elegant. It's expressiveness that I have a hard time even understanding. And I'm now, as I take courses, these courses, and we give some are given right here in this retirement community that I'm living in. The courses for elders, learning in retirement, that's the basic idea. I've taken several poetry courses just to sort of, and I'm not sure why I have a hard time, because I love metaphors, but I think I don't naturally think in those terms, and I'd like to be able to do more thinking creatively in that way, with the metaphors, with poetry, and literature.
Okay. On that note, what is your favorite book? Or books?
Well, some time ago I would have said Middlemarch. And I still go back and read sections of it, because it's an amazing combination of fiction and nonfiction. Fiction that includes a great deal of history of that time and place, history of the mores, the ways of living in that time and place. And the reading that I do is more directly biography and autobiography, memoirs.
Okay.
One I just finished is called, there could be umpteen books called An American Family.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the American family, and you may remember, it's the story, the public acknowledgement or the public disclosure of this history of this American family was at the public, as far as I knew, at the Democratic National Convention. It's the story of the Muslim family, a Gold Star family, whose son was killed. And who spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Then I heard him here as he received an award from the American Civil Liberties Union. And finally, he wrote a book about his life as a Muslim immigrant from Pakistan, and his wife the same. And the boys they brought up here, his strong feeling of how he loves America and what it has meant to him as an immigrant in this country. And he carries around in his pocket the Constitution of the United States, and he, wherever he speaks, he holds up the Constitution of the United States. And he wanted to be sure that our president knew the Constitution as well as, and respected it as he does. Before that, the book that I read and loved was a book of the writings of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, the notorious RBG, as one book about her is called.
Okay. Related question to that. If you could tell President Trump one thing, what would you tell him?
Well, that's what Mr. Khan was doing with
his right,
holding up the institution, and I guess that's the most important thing, that we do have a constitution, and this is a country of laws, not men.
Okay. If you could have dinner with anybody dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh, I don't know. I can't answer that one.
Okay. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I don't know, because I don't believe in pearly gates and so on and so forth. I don't want to answer that one either.
Okay. Finally, what advice might you offer to graduate students, beginning teachers, and or beginning researchers who hope to make a contribution like you to education and educational research?
Well, teachers can make a contribution as well, because teachers can do little mini informal research projects. In the course of being a teacher and trying to understand individual kids, or getting reactions from the group to a book or a curriculum unit, whatever. So I guess the important I would give to any is to, I don't want to say remember issues of equity, but wherever you are, figure out what are the main tough points, tough questions, tough issues, tough stumbling blocks for you, and see what you can do to figure out, learn something more about how you could tackle them.
Okay.
I think that's, in a more general sense, the only suggestion I can make.
Okay, thank you. And on behalf of all of us, the educators, scholars, future educationists, educational researchers, and the like, we thank you, Dr. Courtney Cazden, for everything you do, and most importantly, for being you. And that's it for the show.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to have joined your list of people from the Academy. I think it's a great idea to have this available.
Well, we're delighted to have had you and
Thank you.
ability to honor you. Thank you.